Are we all in? Okay, well, welcome everybody to our second PCC Forum for fall 2022, and it's an absolute delight to welcome our own Dr. Jack Bagby to present to us tonight on Plato's Phaedo and philosophy and spirituality of music in connection with that. What was the exact title again, Jack?
It's really wordy. What is it? Tuning, caring for, and recollecting the soul in Socrates Swansongs.
That's lovely. So it's going to be a wonderful evening tonight. I'm really looking forward to this. Let me just say a couple of quick words about Jack before we get started. For those of you who haven't had a chance to be in Jack's Merleau-Ponty class this semester, Jack is our newest PCC faculty member. He received his PhD from Boston College, where he did a dissertation on Aristotle's theory of dynamics, looking at the ancient Greek roots of process philosophy. It's essentially, from what I understand it, it's on Aristotle, but also on Bergson. Jack brings a huge amount of expertise, both in 20th century and 21st century French thought, phenomenology, Bergson, Merleau-Ponty, but also 19th century French spiritualism, people like Félix Ravesson, Maine de Biron, and others. Very exciting stuff. If you ever get a chance to talk to him about that, please don't miss the opportunity. Before he did his PhD at Boston College, he did an MA there as well, and he has a BA from Penn State, where he majored in philosophy and minored in ancient Greek. The other thing I want to say about Jack, in addition to his interests in ancient Greek philosophy and contemporary French thought, integral metaphysics, ecology, things of that sort, he has two courses I want to highlight for you next semester, one of which is directly related to what he's talking about tonight. So when you're looking at registering, if you're in the program currently, you might want to keep your eye out for PARP 6151. It's philosophy of music, attunement of soul. It's going to be a little bit like what he's previewing here tonight, going to be moving in between sort of ancient and all the way from ancient philosophies of music and their relationship to the soul and the great mysteries of birth, death, rebirth, and so forth, into contemporary philosophy of music and thinking about things in the 20th and 21st century. He also has a really exciting course on the metaphysics of integral ecology, PARP 6129, that I encourage you to check out in the catalog. But that's not why you came here tonight. You didn't come here to listen to me talk to you about classes we're offering, even though we're very proud of them. You came to listen to Dr. Jack Bagby. And so with that, let me hand it over to Jack. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much, Jake. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Lily, for helping set this up, and everyone for coming. This is a great turnout. I'm just turning on my slides here. Great. All right, so I'm gonna talk about a lot of different topics tonight, and they're all kind of interrelated, interconnected, basically with like what is Socratic philosophy. But I'm gonna come at it from a lot of different angles, so I think that there's like something for everyone here. So if one section is kind of like, I don't know, just hold with me, because in the next section you'll probably find something good. So just bear with me on the kind of interdisciplinary approach that I took to this paper. Well, this is a paper I'm working on, but this isn't the paper itself. This is kind of extrapolations from that. So I'm just going to get started. In the Phaedo, Plato recounts the final moments of Socrates' life as he awaited the death penalty for the capital offenses of corrupting the youth and of atheism. In his famous defense speech called the Apology, he told the 500 men of Athens, casting votes on his case, that he was a gift to the city from the god Apollo, that he was a bringer of self-knowledge and therefore of higher truths capable of improving human life and society, but truths that the Athenians were incapable of accepting. He told them they were supremely ignorant and worthless in terms of the knowledge of good and beautiful things, and that the only way they could escape their ignorance and the injustice that came from it was to confront the condition of their soul philosophically, with openness, resolution, and curiosity, rather than what they were doing, which was shamefully evading and repressing the truth through lies and manipulations. Socrates refused to part ways with his dignity and integrity, refused to succumb to the custom of the corrupt Athenian democracy. He refused to cling to life through bribery, even though it had become frequent practice, and even his close friends were begging him to escape in exile. He refused to deploy rhetoric and emotional manipulations aimed at self-gain. Instead, he used this moment to reveal the truths of philosophy as he was accustomed to doing, and making manifest the inadequacies and injustices of Athenian political institutions. Socrates attempted to show the judges their own ignorance, to have them witness his philosophical method by getting them to participate in it and experience what it consisted of firsthand. To overcome their reticence to engaging authentically with him, Socrates pointed to a universal aspect of human existence, the inevitability of death, and our ignorance of what it has in store for us. Our ignorance of death does not stop us from fearing it, and these fears can often make people cling to life in shameful ways. Socrates used philosophical questioning to show us the human condition. He didn't want to merely tell us what he thinks or share his opinions, but wanted to lead us to confront what it means to be human for ourselves. He wanted us to ask the questions and take them seriously, which only happens if we are curious and receptive to encountering our ignorance. Now, Socrates said famously, "The fear of death is nothing else than thinking oneself wise when one is ignorant." Dying may in fact be the greatest good, but most people treat it as the greatest evil and would do anything to escape it. Death's relation to philosophy is not merely an armchair fascination or something but is something that we must all inevitably do. The encounter with death can initiate a profound spiritual transformation, and Socratic philosophy attempts to bring the same insights that the encounter with death has to fruition in a deeper way. Death is a problem which encompasses many profound questions. What happens when you die? Why are we so afraid of death? Can the way we live our life affect the way we die or our fate after death? Death is this peculiar certainty which hides so many unknowns. It also brings us face to face with the contingency, uncertainty, and fragility of life. Now, death is something that we, for the most part, can never really be familiar with. We cannot form a stable and predictable relationship to it like we do things in the world and our friends. No matter how many loved ones we lose, it never becomes easier. If loss becomes manageable or routine, this is only because we close ourselves off from its reality. We cannot form an average or basic understanding of it in its whole significance. No argument or book about it will ever be definitive. Sorry, Robert, who's writing a book on death. Death is always questionable. It's always a source of astonishment, wonder, and terror. It is a kind of known unknown. No one wants to talk about death. It makes us uncomfortable, sad, and fearful. It's perhaps the easiest thing to avoid talking about or thinking about. Most people will change the subject or let you change the subject if the topic comes up. We are most willing to ignore the questions of death and most likely to avoid talking about it. It's even kind of rude to talk about it since it's so traumatic. And the same thing goes for being ignorant. No one wants to appear ignorant, much less so to others. It's rude to make other people appear ignorant. Socrates always looks rude in the Apology, just as his unwillingness to cling to life looks often like a sort of self-righteous suicide. The fact that Socrates' defense speech induced anger, resentment, and fear in the judges likely helped lead to his guilty verdict. The majority of the judges, it seems, would rather erase the person pointing out their faults than confront these faults and admit their ignorance. Now, despite Socrates' apparent agnosticism and his profession of being totally ignorant in the Apology, it's clear in the Phaedo that he actually viewed the encounter with death as capable of not only showing us our ignorance, but of revealing true and beautiful things to us. The problem of death is related for Socrates to the question, what is life? And this brings us back to the meaning of philosophy itself. Death opens these questions up in an existential dimension. I am the one who is questioning death, ignorance, non-being, and existence. I am the one who exists and who will die. Socrates not only makes the questionableness of death apparent, He also shows us the seriousness of this problem as it relates to our existence and links these problems to the questions of justice and one's place in their community and history. That's kind of like the broad arc of where I'm going to take this talk. This is what Nietzsche calls Socrates' piety. He is put to death for his way of life, and he refuses to cling to life when others would have turned to lies, manipulations, and bribes to avoid death. It is the intensity and integrity of Socrates' life that we see in his death. And already in the Apology, this dichotomy of life and death as a kind of dualism is becoming questionable, problematic, and multi-layered. And in the Phaedo, we see Socrates take this one step further and describe philosophy as a preparation for death. Now, in the days leading up to his execution, Socrates spent his final days writing music. His songs we hear in the dialogue consisted of some hymns to Apollo, as well as putting some of Aesop's fables to songs that he was composing, and even he was writing some lyrics for himself to these songs. His death had been delayed because an Athenian embassy, a ship, had been sent to Delos the day before, bearing libations to Apollo. This ship is reenacting the ships of Theseus's journey to Crete. And now during the ship's voyage, a wind blew it off course, and while the ship is in voyage, all executions are forbidden within Athens. So he spent a considerable time in prison. Phaedo tells us this is by chance that the ship was blown off course, but it is for this reason that he survived for a long time and was writing these songs to Apollo. The dialogue occurs in the last few hours of his life when several of his friends visited to discuss the nature of the soul and its fate after death. Most of the conversation is between Socrates and his two friends Simmias and Cebes, who were Pythagoreans who had studied with Philolaus, who is a famous music Pythagorean, and they refused to let their beloved friend Socrates die. So I'm going to look at three crucial moments in the dialogue. First, we're going to look at two arguments Socrates gave to convince his friends of the immortality of the soul. Now, scholars like to call these the arguments from Recollecting and the soul as harmony. And then thirdly, we're going to look at the way these discussions relate to philosophy as a preparation for death. I will show how the themes of death, music, and recollection converge in Socrates' view of philosophy, which he tells us is the greatest music. He says philosophy is the greatest music. He also likens himself to one of the sacred swans of Apollo, who sings joyfully as it dies. They apparently sing throughout their life, but specifically the songs they sing before they die is what Socrates brings up. He says they sing these songs because they have a prophetic vision of the blessings that await them in death. Basically, Socrates is referring to these sacred swans, and Apollo sometimes turns into one of these swans, and Orpheus was said to be a reincarnation of a swan, and then he was later perhaps a reincarnation of Pythagoras. But him and the swans, they both sing before they die because they're singing in joy of the life that awaits them in death. Now, given Socrates takes music in such a high esteem in the dialogue, given that he treats music as a spiritually transformative force like philosophy itself, and I'll show that more as we go. Given all of this, it's surprising that he gives such harsh arguments in the dialogue against the Pythagorean view that the soul is analogous to harmony. The word harmonia in Greek doesn't just mean harmony in general. It's not simply like a particular instance of harmonious notes, but it refers to an entire scale, a series of harmonic intervals used to pattern a melody. Oh, my slide got a little mixed up there. That's okay. In the Greek music system, everything was, the scales were based on what's called the tetrachord, which is two 4-note series of notes. So on the outside, you have the octave, like any scale is based on an octave. And then you have mathematical ratios within that structure all of the intervals. So from the two outside notes, which are an octave apart, you have two middle notes. And one is a fifth from the bottom and one is a fifth from the top. And conversely, they're both fourths as well. So I'm not going to get too much into the mathematics or the music behind that, but every harmonia was a structure of intervals that were tuned using these consonant relationships of a fifth, basically. So it's the structuring of those notes that is the harmonia. So as such, it is something elegant, beautiful, perfect, and also invisible, incorporeal, and therefore, according to the Pythagoreans, divine and eternal. It is for this reason that it was commonly taken, not just among Pythagoreans, but in the Greek culture, as an apt analogy to explain the nature of the soul. In the Phaedo, this belief is questioned by Socrates on multiple lines of attack, most of all on the accusation that it might actually prove that the soul emerges from and dies with the composition and dissolution of the body. The account of soul as harmonia given by Simmias is presented in a way that makes it appear hostile to the Pythagorean and Orphic belief and Socratic belief that the soul is immortal and existed prior to its incarnation. Simmias's arguments claim that the soul can die and be dispersed. The phrase scattered to the wind comes up again and again throughout the dialogue. And this argument is a cause of fear and terror and sorrow for all of those present in the dialogue. Socrates' refutation of the soul as harmonia account is in fact aimed only at an inappropriate and false interpretation of the position, which is what is where it is taken to prove the soul is not eternal. Socrates in no way wants to reject the musical metaphors for understanding the soul and philosophy. Now, this is like my claim. This isn't obvious in the dialogue. And this is what I'm showing in my article, basically. Socrates refutes the soul as harmonia and then just moves on. And what I'm trying to show is that, no, in fact, that argument, he wants us to reevaluate it and actually save it. And that's based on things in the dialogue and in other dialogues. So it's as if Simmias, in his way of phrasing the argument of soul as harmonia, put the lyrics to the wrong sort of melody, or played the melody in the wrong scale, or perhaps on an instrument that was out of tune. The soul in Simmias's account is reduced to this fitting together, this harmonization of bodily parts in the organism. And so the soul is treated as the resultant. It's what happens last when all the parts come together. This reduces to the soul to something which emerges from the ordering of bodily forces. The tuning is what emerges last in the lyre after it's been built and then tuned. If this were the case with the soul, then it would be something that comes about last by chance and would be fragile and could easily be destroyed. This view is quite close to certain aspects of what we today call emergence, dissipative structures, autopoiesis, things like that. It's the notion that life and consciousness are properties that arise from complex material processes and form a whole or a gestalt that is greater than the sum of the parts. At first glance, it looks like Socrates is rejecting these views of the new biology rather than presciently anticipating them. Now, I think he did in fact have a holistic, organic, dynamic view of life, by and large in agreement with these anti-reductionisms in contemporary theories. Socrates is just trying to show us that the emergence of order is always guided by the care of the soul or spirit, which pre-exists and survives its incarnations. Rather than reject the analogy of soul as harmonia, we must retune it. We must bring all of the parts into consonance with each other. Instead of thinking of the soul as being the result of tuning, the real account that I'm suggesting is that the soul is in fact what tunes the body and maintains life and even tunes the soul. Both life and health are what emerge from the body being well tuned. Tuning and health are both the outward manifestations, therefore, of the soul's care, attention, and guidance, but they're not the soul itself. We can't reduce the soul to those. They are what the soul is able to bring into being, but not the soul. Socrates does not give this rephrasing directly. Again, this is what I'm putting together in my article, but it comes through in a variety of other statements in the dialogue. He says the soul cares for the body, the soul itself is in need of care, and it judges between equality and inequality and chooses what is best. And that's, of course, something that is required in tuning. You know, you have to listen to the inequalities of the notes and see which direction to go in order to bring them into perfect tune with each other. And in order to do that, you have to be very attentive, you have to care, you have to put your attention and care towards that act. So that's what I'm going to try and get at as we keep going, this idea of care. He also urges his friends on numerous occasions in the dialogue to go back over these arguments and reevaluate them. We are not meant to take the dialogue at its surface value, but are called to engage with it, to question it, and to retune it based on what we find in our own souls and based on the other parts of the dialogue. While attuning is not the soul itself, it is something that never concretely exists unless a soul chooses to bring it into being and cares for its maintenance. The tuning analogy does not directly reveal the essence of the soul, but opens a way to a deeper investigation. This whole discussion points to the paradox that the soul is both perfect and eternal, but also needs to be cared for and tuned. So let's quickly look over these arguments against the soul as harmonia. The first objection given by Socrates is that this account, as Simmias has given it, doesn't sing in accord with the other account they had already given early in the conversation, and that is the account of the soul's immortality proven through our power of recollection. And I'll get into that in a little bit. If we retune this argument, as I've been saying, that the soul is actually this careful attention that tunes rather than the tuning, then we see that the soul actually harmonizes with this other theory of recollection. I'm going to go into that in the next section. The second argument points to an absurd conclusion that seems to follow from Simmias's hypothesis. Socrates says this in a reductio ad absurdum, that all tunings, insofar as they are in tune, are equally in tune. And thus, by analogy, all souls are in the same condition of harmony, and vice becomes impossible. But of course, vice is possible, so reductio ad absurdum, there must be something wrong with this premise. And I'll show in a second how this argument totally fails, but really quick, basically it's saying that the soul needs to be able to tune itself in order for and detune itself for there to be vice. So it already kind of brings back in the idea that the soul is attuning in the very process of refuting that position. The third objection goes for the assumed causal link between the soul and the body in the interpretation. If the contrary qualities in the body undergo transformations, heating and cooling and drying, things like that, the soul would then be merely the result of the body's condition in this new mixture. Well, if that's the case, then the soul will not be something which runs contrary to these changes in the body. This would mean that the soul cannot aid the body in regaining health, and can't even help it escape from the cold, let alone have the moral fortitude to abstain from vice. The soul would be reduced to nothing but the totality of relations between contraries in the body, rather than the rational source of care that directs and improves the body and its circumstances. Now, contrary to what Socrates said in his second objection, he really thought one scale, or harmonia, was capable of being more in tune than another. And this really pulls the rug out from the whole absurdity of the argument he meant to demonstrate. He outlines this in the Republic, how certain scales, in particular the Dorian, are more in tune and more perfect and harmonious. That's the one I was already playing a bit for you. We'll look at it a bit more as we keep going. So just as some scales put us in better states of mind, so too some souls are more just and in a better condition. The best psychical condition, according to Socrates, is achieved through the purifications of philosophy, which are akin to mystical initiation. There was a long poetic tradition in Greece of contrasting Apollonian and Dionysian music styles and treating the former as more orderly and the latter as more chaotic and frenzied. And Socrates connected the Dorian scale, what I was just playing, with Apollo, and the Phrygian scale with Dionysius. That's what I want. Okay. There's a famous myth that has the satire Marsyas lose in a musical competition before the Muses and all of the gods to Apollo. Basically, Marsyas's songs he played on the reed flute called an ulos. These songs were crazy and drove the gods into a mad frenzy. And then Apollo comes up, and his songs on the lyre was said to calm them all and put tears in their eye. In the myth, Apollonian music is healing and contemplative, and Socrates tells us that it is also confidence building and good for educational purposes. Souls that are cared for in the right way can maintain a harmonious tuning, avoiding the snares of the body, which are passions, fear of death, greed, fame, things like that. A well-tuned soul, according to Socrates, loves accounts, meaning that it engages in authentic, vulnerable, honest dialectic, searching for and choosing what is best. It also cares for its own self-improvement and the improvement of its friends and its community. The Dionysian music styles are more akin to the transformative and therapeutic aspects of music. Harmony is not a yes or no question as presented by Socrates at this point in the dialogue. It's not in presence or absence without a middle ground. It's not simply good or bad, but reflects all the divergent human tendencies and potentials. It admits of degrees and nuances. It's a qualitative multiplicity, and some scales are in fact more harmonious than others, just as some ways of life are more just. And vice is not the condition of being out of tune so much as being in a certain tuning. This comes out in the Republic. He says that tyranny is a deranged condition of the soul. That is where the soul is tuned like Mixolydian or Syntonolydian. And this tuning of the soul, he says, is born of licentious gluttony that is, common to aristocratic decadence, and also this kind of cynical oligarchic realpolitik. In short, a disfigured soul is tuned by practicing greed, manipulation, and exploitation. Basically, there's a musical scale for expressing every possible human emotion, attitude, character, and each one uses harmony. The philosophical care given to the soul uses the soul's own powers, its attentiveness, its care, its subtle insights, to precisely tune and improve body, soul, and community. This caring attitude that Socrates is describing is supposed to be expressed by the Dorian tuning of Philolaus, which in the Timaeus is the eternal paradigm used to pattern the world's soul. It's this eternal, perfect, mathematically precise, and omnipresent reality. It's not something that humans invented, they're saying. It's something that we recollect and that is part of the fabric of reality itself. Certainly it had to have emerged at some point in human history, but this would have been merely the discovery of the form within the fabric of the sensible world. Harmony, when we see it in the world, reminds us of what we always already knew in the depths of our soul by virtue of its natural state. The best tuning is brought into being in bodies because it is known to the soul to be the most choice-worthy and perfect, the most in accord with our unconscious, pure prenatal memory, the recollection of our soul's life prior to its birth and its experience of beautiful forms at that time. Musical expertise required for tuning is thus dependent on our memory and requires the account of recollection rather than being at odds with it, as in the first objection. The account only requires being put together with care and attention, a task which Socrates, or perhaps Plato, gave to us to do rather than doing it for us. And the same thing applies in the case of tuning. So this metaphor is really goes from philosophy to music again. So the notes in a scale can appear dissonant. Like if I hit all of them at once, it sounds cacophonous. And if I play certain notes together, it's pretty dissonant. But if I put the sounds in the right order, all I hear is consonances. And so we hear this when tuning. So in order to tune a lyre into Dorian, you start with this string here. I don't know if you look at the first arrow, you go down a fourth, and then the second arrow, you go up a fifth. And then you go from the lowest note up a fifth. And then you go from that middle note again up a fourth. And and then from that one down a fifth, and then up a fourth, and then down a fifth. So when I do that, every single interval I play is consonant. It's a consonance. And so played in the right order, it's consonant. But played in the wrong order or played all at once, it's super dissonant. So that's a really important part of the metaphor here. When we put these accounts together, recollection, as we're going to look into more, the soul as care, the body as tuned, a tuning of contraries, things like that. It only makes sense if it's put together in the right order. So, I was going to say a little bit more. Or no, let's just jump ahead. So the most unique psychical work, the thing that's most unique to the soul is recollection, according to Plato and Socrates. It's the defining characteristic of the soul. Its role in the Phaedo is multiple and reveals several different important features of the soul, which I'm going to look at right now. These passages suggest that the bedrock of our psychical activity is the judgment of equality, similitude, and sameness. This affirmation is based on our prior knowledge of the forms. We make sense of the world only because of our apprehension of the forms prior to this life. The forms are sort of the deep structure of our psyche. They shape all of our thoughts. The lesson of Socrates' reflection on recollection is this: if there is an activity, a structure, or form of thought that is at work in every thought, then it must be essential to the nature of thought itself, if not the essence of the soul itself. Recollection reveals the true nature of the soul. The essence of the soul is evident in its power of preserving life, and life preserving is also what memory does and what recollection does. It preserves memories. Also, the power of gathering up and concentrating our attention, enriching what we give our attention to, discovering insights that intensify the soul's ability to think, and what improves the clarity of its reasoning. Everything in music, philosophy, and the soul stems from this power of recollection, anamnesis. Socrates tells us that recollection also explains our capacity for distinguishing differences, inequalities, and everything that falls short of the form. We must judge between dissonances in order to tune the string of a lyre. I already showed you this, but there's a bunch of dissonances there that you need to listen carefully to in order to know how to move the note into tune. You're not only listening to the consonant, therefore you're also listening to the dissonances and the contrasts. Recollection doesn't just reduce a particular back to a static abstract archetype, but lets connections be added and differences be contrasted. Through recollection, the soul both gathers, unifies, and assimilates, as well as disperses, separates, and differentiates. Recollection allows for the perfect recall of events in precise order, as well as remote and imaginative associations between formerly unrelated memories and thoughts. And I'm going to, in a second, go on to look at some of these imaginative associations that Socrates gives us. It's this plasticity and latitude of recollection that is evoked by Socrates in the Phaedo. The divergent tendencies of recollection are reflected in the paradox of learning. Do we genuinely learn by an act of creation that institutes a novel, thoughtful insight? Or do we merely remove an obstacle? Do we remove our forgetfulness? What I'm saying is learning about our own soul, in fact, merely retrieving a truth already in our souls? Or more importantly, a truth that is actually constitutive of what our soul is? When we discover our soul's true nature, are we not merely remembering what we had forgotten? This is the ultimate paradox of the soul in its process of philosophical self-knowledge, this retreat into the self, which resembles death. Socrates crafts images using subtle ambiguities to metaphorically approach the nature of the soul from multiple angles. Each reveals essential and overlapping aspects. Socrates invites us to follow these many thematic metaphors, themes of, these threads of music, care, and death, as well as many etymological paths of association, which I'm going to talk about in the next section. And he shifts through various images for the living body as well. He says it's like a cloak, it's like a lyre, it's like the tuning of a lyre. and various images of philosophy, sailing, dying, setting traps, animal tracking, weaving, midwifery, the songs of swans, and many other images throughout Plato's works. Socrates calls our attention to the associative movement that makes this possible while discussing recollection here. He gave several examples. He says, a lover will go from the image of their beloved's lyre to immediately think of its owner, the beloved. And this is a kind of recollective association. We can go from the thing to the one who uses it or made it. We are invited by Socrates to go from these associated images involving the body and the soul to the soul itself. The chain of recollections can move in almost any direction or come to the same place from many directions, right? But generally, and he says there's 1,000 connections you can make, generally always we follow some similarity or some contrast. The soul can spiral out into more and more remote associations, or this chain can lead the soul back up into itself, where it can come to know itself on its own terms and not through a metaphor or an association. When we arrive in the soul, it is the very activity of being imaginative, of drawing associations, of turning our attention to differences and gathering memories up in our minds that we find our soul. We can jump from the images to the inner intuition of our own soul. The recognition that recollection is the essence of the soul is born from an act of recollection itself, in which we gather up our soul as the one actually remembering who we are. So recollection radiates out, it disperses and scatters itself into several different activities: learning, recognizing, distinguishing, remembering, caring, even tuning, judging consonances, and singing in tune with someone. It is both the unity and the multiplicity. It's the same power manifesting itself in many divergent faculties. The care of philosophy is connected with gathering up the soul, and this happens in recollection and in death. I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of care. Care in Greek, mele, melete, meletema, also translated as practice, is central to the Phaedo, and with it comes a certain wordplay with limbs, like your physical limbs, meles, and the word song in Greek, which is melos. The claim that care is a work that is particular to the soul arises also in the Republic. Socrates says that along with living and maintaining life, taking care of something and thinking are the works that only the soul and mind can accomplish. The living body is not the soul, nor strictly speaking is it life, plain and simple. Instead, it is a dynamic condition of the body, arranged and adjusted by the soul, so as to be able to sustain life, and this condition must be ever maintained, ever taken care of, tuned by the soul. The limbs are part of the body, meles, and Socrates says it is by being held together in the right way, by being harmonized, and this comes right after the refutation of the soul as harmonia. It's by harmonizing these physical processes that the living body functions well and is capable of doing good things. The limbs have bones and sinews, he says, and it is by tightening and relaxing those sinews that the body has mobility and repose. Socrates goes so far as to say that without a properly tuned body, and here he uses all the familiar musical vocabulary to describe tightening and loosening, if the body is not properly tensed, it becomes impossible to accomplish good things that the soul thoughtfully intends and undertakes with care. The care, mele, of the soul uses the limbs, mele, to accomplish its intentions when they are properly prepared to participate in the song of the soul. Socrates clarifies this point. While it's true to say that limbs, bones, and sinews are needed, it is not true to say that the deed is done through them, that they are the cause of the good achieved, which in fact requires the action of the mind, an insight which motivates us to choose what's best. A well-tuned lyre is needed to play a song, but it's not the song. To say the opposite, Socrates says, to say that the body is the cause, is to slacken or loosen in speech. Here he again uses the music terminology. The account becomes dissonant, he says, when it lacks the proper attribution of causality. It sings out, he says, as evidently dissonant from what is evident in our souls, from our self-examination of recollection. We have all witnessed ourselves caring and using memory to improve the situations of our lives. Once we have ventured into the soul and witnessed these activities and examined the evidence of the influence of the soul, any account of body, nature, or life that is at variance with this evidence will forever appear as dissonant with what we recollect as true. The recollective and caring acts of the soul are the sort of fundamental tones which are used to tune all of the other accounts within our life. This awareness of the detuning of the account at this point in the dialogue constitutes the beginning of what Socrates called his second sailing. Socrates used this metaphor to describe an event in his own philosophical journey and self-transformation, and he mentions this in multiple dialogues. This second sailing refers to a sailboat that deploys the oars after the wind gives out. It means to begin to sail by the power of the ship rather than being blown to and fro by the wind, or the wind no longer blows. And we should also remember the thematic moment within the dialogue that Socrates is still alive because the Athenian embassy had been blown off of its course. When the external force of the wind dies down or pushes us in the wrong direction, the soul must step up and use its own resources, care, recollection, and thoughtfulness to continue on its journey. Metaphorically, the evidence of the senses, physiology, natural science alone cannot bestow knowledge of the soul, which is only accessed by turning inward and investigating oneself through their own initiative. Next, I want to look at a few speculative etymologies that occur throughout the dialogue that connect us back to these same themes. Radcliffe Edmonds has done an excellent job of tracking and interpreting several etymological webs woven by Socrates in the Phaedo, particularly dealing with a cluster of words connecting singing to the sublime peace of the philosopher in the face of death. Here's the quote. This is what Edmonds did to kind of stitch all these words together. The singing, aidein, of the nightingale, aiedon, links together the realm of Hades, Hiedon, with the unseen, aide, and the eternal, aidon, realm of the forms, aide, which the soul can perceive by knowing, aidenai, which it makes itself, when it makes itself without pleasures, aides, and pains of the body. Rather than a lament, the song of the nightingale, and here think also the Swansongs, is transformed into an incantation that permits the philosopher to face death without fear. Deos. There are a few other etymological webs of association I want to suggest, linking up with the themes of music. One I've already mentioned, which is care, melain and limbs, melos, and song, melos. And this association appears in the Homeric hymns to Apollo, the very ancient ones. Quoting one, then straightway the undying gods think or put their heart to, mele, care for, only the lyre and song. And all the muses together voice sweetly, answering voice, hymn the unending gifts of the gods and the sufferings of men. Caring or putting one's heart and attention to something is linked to musicality as a spiritual practice in praise of the gods. Proclus, my backgrounds disappeared for some reason. I'm sorry if these are hard to read. They had black backgrounds on these texts, but so Proclus connects him to something that remains, hup monon, to recollection, hope mnesis, and to celebration, hudein. This is, of course, a highly speculative and even simply imaginative etymology, like those in Plato's Cratylus, but there are bits of insight in it that make evident the connection between music and the soul. Singing is at once an act of remembering and of celebrating. One of the lines in the hymn to Apollo starts by saying, mnemesomai ode lathomai, which is, I will remember and not be forgetful. Many of the Homeric hymns, including Apollo's, end with the line, I shall remember you and make another song. Recall also that the Muses were the daughters of Mnemosyne, the Titan goddess of memory. And an older Boeotian myth held that there were only three muses, Melete, practice, Ode, voice, and Mneme, memory. The etymological connections between care and song are extended by a play on words to the verb melo, meaning to be about to do something, and also to be destined or to intend to do something. The word mellow, again, looks like melos in these other words, points to the imminent future and anything that is about to happen. And this happens frequently in a dialogue that deals with where we end up when we die. Socrates and the swans are about to die, and so they have this prophetic foreknowledge of what is to come. A further ambiguity is implied since Mello describes the uncertainty and probability of a horizon of the future, anything that is contingent, that is about to happen. This is an open future. The song is a condition, the soul is in a condition such that it's about to do something, right? Because it's attuned in some way, it's melo, about to do something. The care of philosophy tempers the soul to be mindful and practice philosophy. The melodic soul prepares one to act in this way. And, Socrates had no shortage in his life of opportunities to practice philosophy. This practice, meletes, makes one ready to act as soon as the time comes. And even in his defense speech, he was about to administer his practice. The song of his soul is being about to care for the souls of others. And he also says that the soul of a philosopher is in the care of the gods. A philosopher who's about to die, he says, melon, has a confidence born of wisdom and mindfulness. This syllable mel at the beginning connects this recollective web of associations and connects it again even further to bees, Melissa, and honey, Meli. Socrates likens himself to a bee in the dialogue at 91c and suggests that philosophers are actually reincarnations of bees. Bees and honey are closely associated with Dionysus. Mead was the more ancient drink than wine, and the god as an infant was nurtured by bees in a cave. Persephone also had the epithet molitetos, honey sweet. And in general, honey and bees had chthonic, earthly and underworldly connotations. The bees even represented the soul itself in myths related to Artemis. Hesiod called the bees the birds of the muses, which is a great phrase. I love that. And he says that they would put honey on the lips of those they inspired. This applies also to the power of persuasion, such as the sweetly flowing voice of Nestor in the Iliad. This connection of sweetness and music also makes its way into Aristotle's analysis of music. He says that music has a power to gladden our hearts and ease our toils. Consider how honey is not only pleasurable from its sweetness, but also was used for a variety of medical treatments, dressing wounds, and also for preserving food. Honey is an excellent preserver with strong antibacterial properties. Bees and honey were not only representations of the beauty and preserving aspects of the soul, but also represent the ability to carefully guide other souls through processes of transformation related to the mysteries. Julie Sanchez Parodi elegantly summarizes this. Whether we consider the gathering of pollen by bees and the subsequent production of honey within a hive, or the communal gathering of initiatic wisdom by the ancients at Eleusis, we observe a powerful symbol for the distillation of spiritual energy. Partaking of this energy is transformative, leading to psychological and spiritual regeneration. The goddess, the priestess, and their sisters, the bees, united these emblems for the vital human activity, one that leaves us pure, ever new, and reborn. The bee was an important symbol for the transformative power of mystical initiations in the Eleusinian mysteries, and certainly the revelation that they received in these initiations had to do with the soul's true nature becoming known to it. This is what gave those who experienced the confidence that the destination after death is better than the toils of life. But only the transformation of proper initiation have the power to deliver souls to the better destination. This initiation requires that there are people or spirits or daimons or gods capable of leading us to such an experience. Socrates presents philosophy as the most potent form of initiation of all. Philosophy is the greatest music. It is the most therapeutic method for healing the soul. I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm going to skip over this last thing, I was going to just connect the idea of harmonia, tuning, to this other term tonos, which also means tuning, but also means effort and tension. And it again connects this idea of care through tonos being a kind of effort to the care of the soul. I'm just going to jump to my conclusion. So I'll end by emphasizing how Socrates references to Orphic and Dionysian mysteries root his philosophy in the earth and as a social political way of life. Preparing for and caring for death doesn't mean literally dying or committing suicide. Socrates follows the Pythagorean condemnation of suicide. It is instead a living activity. We are here in the ironic and coded, layered world of Platonic philosophy, where nothing is ever merely what it seems to be on the surface. Preparing for death is the key to the good life, since it is key to philosophical transformations. By Socrates' genius for ambiguity, what he refers to as caring for death, also means practicing or training for death, mele, but it also is a kind of song of death, melos, right? The song of philosophy is this swan song of the soul that cares for the soul and sings to lead souls towards truth and joy. It is no coincidence that such transformations also arise in near-death experiences, and we are given one in the Republic, the tale of at the very end of the Republic. And the allusions to Orphic spiritualism and Eleusinian mysteries again suggest a really good parallel, because their insight is the same as the insight that you get from the encounter with death. The preparation for death is not a rejection of life or renunciation of the body, but a purification of the soul from its fears, terrors, and passions, especially those related to death and clinging to the merely apparent goods in life, like wealth, fame, honor, and power, which defile the soul and place it in service, Socrates says, of tyrannical masters. What is revealed to the initiate in their journey institutes a whole new orientation for their life. The psychonautic journey that emerges from the encounter with death sparks a transformation that enables one to conduct psychagogic care for others. One must, again, retain the memory of their journey in order to use it to help others through the same transformation. The experience brings a gestalt shift in thinking and attitude that manifests in the person's actions, which will, on the whole, become oriented towards healing, kindness, and justice. We should also remember that Orpheus was a musician who was said to be able to charm humans, animals, plants, and even rocks with his songs. Now, Demeter also played an important role in the Eleusinian and Orphic myths. She was the goddess of fertility and food production, the daughter of Re and Gaia, and granddaughter of Gaia. And she is deeply rooted in the earth's fertility and the growth of nature, a divine archetype of vitality. And just as Demeter had to go rescue her daughter Persephone from Hades to restore life to earth, so the initiate in the mysteries must rescue their soul from the tomb of the body. And here, tomb, the body as a tomb just means vice, greed, dishonesty, fear, those kinds of affects. Death takes on the opposite meaning to literal death, and the body is reborn into a spiritual life. Death becomes the everyday state of people living in ignorance and fear. This theme appears again in the dismemberment and rebirth of Dionysus. The initiate wakes up from their entranced state, this sort of nightmare of living among shadows in a cave, to be transformed in rebirth. The initiate dies to their shadow self and finds new life. While the vital principle of life can go into hibernation, can mimic death like the trees lose their leaves in the winter, this does not destroy the soul, which endures into the next season. The soul goes into Hades beneath the earth like seeds, but it comes back and brings life to the body as plants emerge in spring and fruit in the summer. The soul is reawakened in the encounter with death, and one must retain the memory of their journey in order to lead others. I agree with Kazmiezer Pawlowski that Socrates' hidden doctrine is this knowledge that is only accessible to the soul through a transformational self-knowledge like initiation into a mystery. This mystical transformation is the necessary step in the soul's developmental processing, enabling it to do philosophy. Now, Socrates' whole philosophy is a way of life rather than a doctrine. It's a life oriented toward caring for the souls of his friends and his community. Phaedo, according to Diogenes Laertius, was a formerly enslaved person who, after meeting Socrates and displaying an aptitude for philosophy, had his freedom purchased by either Socrates, Cebes, Crito, or Alcibiades. We're not sure. This narrative element, though, Socrates' care and affection for Phaedo, his desire to free him from bondage in life and in soul, exemplifies the transformative power of philosophical initiation. Phaedo describes how Socrates was intimate with his friends in his last moments, at one point caressing Phaedo's hair as he lovingly joked with him, in order to lighten the spirits of someone who had already begun to deeply mourn the imminent loss of his friend. We are also told that Socrates had his body cleaned before he died so that the women working in the prison wouldn't have the trouble of cleaning a corpse. In the last moments of his life, he's still concerned with what's about to happen with his body. Mellow, remember? In no way is he concerned with himself and his soul in a sort of egoism or escaping into fantasy or contemplation. His death was not a self-righteous renunciation of embodied life, nor was he relinquishing his responsibility to his community. Socrates is anything but neglectful of concrete life and community, and so too our preparation for death must be a living work undergone with care and intelligence, a work which we undertake as a community, aiding each other in tuning our souls, conspiring to improve our community, and caring for its fate after we die and leave it behind. In sharp contrast to the portrait of Socrates as an atheist who corrupts the youth, Plato shows Socrates as almost taking on the form of various divinities: Apollo, Hades, Demeter, Dionysus, Asclepius, and of course he's this guy who's possessed by a guardian spirit called a daimon. He is even compared to the hero Theseus in this dialogue, and then later in the dialogue he's compared to the Minotaur whom Theseus slayed in the labyrinth. And with the help of Ariadne's thread, Theseus found his way back out of the labyrinth and rescues the prisoners that the Minotaur had in order to return home. But Socrates, right, pulls us out of our caves. But Socrates doesn't always appear as a hero. For example, when Alcibiades broke in the symposium to confess his love to Socrates, he accuses him of being a Marsyas, remember from earlier, someone whose way of questioning puts the listener into a state of frenzy and confusion. Indeed, in many dialogues, we see Socrates walk away satisfied from a conversation in which he just brought his interlocutor to a paralyzing state of ignorance. The opponent is defeated and left trapped, wandering dazed and confused in a maze among shadows, still driven about by fear, the fear to survive. Euthyphro, on the day of Socrates' defense speech, accuses him of being a maze builder like Daedalus and trapping people in labyrinths like in Crete. And actually, Socrates is supposed to be a descendant of Daedalus, so that connection's even stronger. And sometimes Socrates, for these reasons, appears to lack the follow-through of a method aimed at successful therapeutic transformation. Nevertheless, Plato tries to show us that this purely aporetic philosophy, this agnosticism, this attempt to just stir up confrontation with human ignorance and with death, that was actually balanced out and oriented by a sort of piety and religious project of spreading insights into spiritual life. Socrates, like Penelope, weaves and unweaves the threads of associations in our soul. In the Phaedo, Socrates provides us with the thread, like Ariadne's, to escape. Like Prometheus, he wants to alleviate our suffering and toil. And so Plato vindicates Socrates as this semi-divine healer, this hero of Athens, one whom the Athenians were too wicked to tolerate, too ignorant to take heed of, too selfish and fear-driven to join with him in the chorus of just and beautiful souls that care for each other and seek what is best in a dialogue of a philosophically reflective community. Now, while Plato kind of leaves our heads spinning with all of these references that I've traced, all these associations and these faulty arguments that need to be corrected, we're also given the opportunity to just let these all fall away and to leap directly into our own soul and recollect our true nature. So that's that's my talk.
That's great, Jack. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jack. So we have time. We have about 45, 50 minutes available to us for questions and dialogue with Jack, which is great. I'm going to invite you to use one of two different ways to engage. Either use the raise hand function or type something into the chat, and we'll keep an eye on the chat box as well to see if anything's popping up there. But if you use your raise hand function under your reactions button, it'll make you pop to the top of the screen so that we make sure that we see you, since we have too many people here to fit, at least on my Hollywood Squares Zoom grid. So let me just get started while people are thinking of questions and comments and things they'd like to talk about. I want to say thanks, Jack, for that incredibly rich paper. I'm really excited to read the final version of it. That it's you were singing a song that I love. So thank you very much for doing that. There's so many things I'd love to dive in to and talk with you more deeply about, but I'm just going to start with a more general one. I've been reading lately. I've been really moved by an essay by the Canadian philosopher Jan Zwicky that engages with Plato's Phaedo. It's called the essay is called "The Ship from Delos." And,
okay, the ship to Delos.
I think it's called "A Ship from Delos."
Oh, ship from Delos. Okay.
And what she does is she's just an absolutely marvelous philosopher, one of my favorites. She's the partner of Robert Bringhurst, the great sort of poet and scholar of Haida communities and First Nations communities up there in Canada. But what Zwicky is doing in the Ship from Delos essay is she's trying to go back to the Phaedo in order to think about our moment of ecological collapse and death, really. And so at one point, she says, humans collectively are now in Socrates' position. The ship with black sails has been sighted. Catastrophic global ecological collapse is on the horizon. There's fine talk coming from at least some political rostra, but nothing remotely like adequate measures are being undertaken. And so then she goes on to add that while Socrates may have been innocent, those of us who are, on like the privileged side of the economies of developed nations, we don't have this advantage. So the ships are coming, the black sails are there, and when we go, we're going to take a lot of innocent beings with us. It's a short essay, and she tries to read the Phaedo and Plato's larger corpus for insights into how we can live in the face of this kind of extraordinary looming death. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how these kind of insights, this initiation into a world in which, this initiation into an experience in which death doesn't have to be feared and that frees us for moral action. How does that, how do you think about that practically in the context of the 21st century and things like that? That's a huge question, I know, but
yeah.
I kept thinking about it.
It's a wonderful question, though. Yeah. Wow. So also the moment with the black sails that was such a powerful moment, because I didn't mention this at all, but in the story, so when Theseus is coming back, I think it's his father is like waiting to see which sail, if it's white sails or black sails. And when it's black sails, he actually like commits suicide. Yep. So it's a really dark like aspect of that story as well. And that is the feeling that I think a lot of the burnout, climate dread and climate fear and kind of, one of the things that the dialogue really plays with is the very gray area between music and philosophy, perhaps too, being a method of escape and versus engagement, right? So like we listen to music to kind of like forget about the day, and like sometimes that's really important, like you need to do that, but also it has this propensity, and like there's this double propensity thing that Socrates gets at all the time with his term pharmakon, which means both the cure and the poison, right? And so I mean, this I think is really what I love so much about Platonic philosophy and Socrates, is this very intense self-critique and reevaluating, like, what is philosophy, what are we here to do as philosophers, kind of like never being at ease with that question, right? And I think that that's what philosophy has to offer today. I mean, for people teaching philosophy sort of to the masses or something, like when I was teaching at Boston College, I wasn't like immediately converting everyone to practicing, or like preparing for death or whatever you want to call it, like engaging in philosophy as the main thing you're doing, and like reevaluating the world, trying to help other people's souls get there. But the impact is still palpable, right? And like, Socrates in a way looks like a failure. He makes this plea, tries to show the Athenians what philosophy is, and then they kill him. So like he kind of does fail in a way, and like it's not as if Athens just like became this paragon of like perfect society after that and like removed all of the horrible things from its political institutions and its like imperialism and chauvinism and all that stuff. So it's not as if philosophers historically have just like instantly succeeded, but echoing through that history is a call to do better, right? And I think that that's what I really, this daimon that is either Socrates' voice talking to us or even our own inner voice that's pushing us ahead to try and reinvent the world. We're not supposed to enter back into Socrates' world, but we're supposed to take, this is at least what I'm trying to say, is we're supposed to take inspiration for a kind of, courageous attitude and attunement of our soul to do what we have to do in our time. And again, to be able to kind of have this, I don't want to say escape because I'm trying to not make it the negative version, but have this kind of antidote to that fear, which is this confidence in our life beyond this world, our higher spiritual reality, and that by fulfilling our spiritual calling, that's going to be good enough in our life, even if we personally can't solve all the world's problems, right?
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. I think that note about that one way to think about it, I guess, is that Socrates points to a way of doing philosophy whose goods are internal to the practice itself. And so even apart from the outcome, it should yield good outcomes. It, like as you were pointing out, it yielded compassion for those around him and enormous moral, not just moral effort, but also friendship. And yet it's good as internal to it. So it's not outcome based. That's powerful.
Yeah,
Thanks
and
for that.
you also get this idea, just to connect a little bit with, I don't want to say necessarily like ecology, but because Socrates is often in the city, and when he goes out of the city in the Phaedrus, it's like this weird moment where like, oh, Socrates is in nature, he's not in culture anymore, because that's kind of his mission. But
he does listen to the cicadas.
He does, exactly. And they're singing a song, right? And what kind of songs are they singing? I don't know, but probably songs like the world soul songs, right? Which is this kind of way that he's attuned his soul to the natural world, even if he's kind of just like in the city all of his life.
Awesome. I'd love to talk more about it, but I will let others join in the conversation. So if you have a question or comment, please use the raise hand function or pop it into the chat box here. Kat, why don't you go next?
Hey, Jack, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. I would love to have you just go from where you just were about the soul's relationship with the natural world. And what I'm thinking is that, in our thinking about climate change and some of the roots of this separation, that part of the task of that is to develop this reciprocal participatory relationship with the natural world, where there's a giving on both sides, or receiving on both sides. So can you talk about, like, how does the soul engage in that kind of reciprocity with the body or the natural world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, the resources for thinking about that in Plato and in Socrates are very inchoate or nascent or burgeoning, but they're not developed, right? Although there's still this idea that, like, fundamentally what's best in our soul is the same thing that's what's best in the natural world. So you can kind of think of it like order, the emergence of order and harmony and things like that in the natural world that we see, plants, animals, ecosystems, things like that. That way of organizing and attuning and harmonizing isn't any different from the way that we do that within our own souls. So it's not about, like, Greek culture being the best at forming a civilization or something like that. It's like, it's about the soul being able to follow the same attunement of the natural world. And I really don't find in Plato, like, too much more. I mean, there's this stuff in the Timaeus that really, like, gets at this, how, like, going inward in the Republic and, like, in other dialogues and, like, learning about the soul, and then going out into the world, we find that the world soul is the same as us, and that the world should be understood, the natural world should be understood as akin to consciousness, rather than anything like what we have in the modern time, Descartes and everybody who wants to reduce it to kind of external mechanisms and just inanimate stuff, right? But yeah, I really think that, I mean, there's a lot of, like, great inspiration that we can take from Socratic philosophy, this really, like, honest, vulnerable space of questioning and, being in dialogue with others and all of that we need in the ecological movement, right? And I think it exists within the ecological movement, but it's one of these things, again, like, it's never complete. We always need to be reworking, rethinking, readapting ourselves, and being self-critical in that way, that I think is, like, what Socrates is so great at displaying for us. Yeah.
Sean, would you like to jump in here?
Sure, yes. Thank you, Jack, that was so rich. You really reminded me and opened up new perspectives on just how rich Plato is, rich aesthetically, psychospiritually, and particularly I was struck by how reminded, I recollected, as it were, how foundational Plato's insights are, and how generative they have been, and particularly in these three areas of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. The philosophical and the cosmological have been very much in my mind recently, philosophically with Hegel, and the centrality of the role of recollection, particularly in the phenomenology of spirit, which but the whole Hegelian approach to philosophy is one of recollection of the evolution of spirit,
Yeah.
leading to the present, which is the very mark of wisdom for Hegel, is that process of recollection, which can generate an account, a story that can make coherent one's own perspective in the present, right? And and then just recently, I finished rereading Brian's Cosmogenesis, where Brian does this beautiful move of not only initiating us, helping us become initiated into the story, the ongoing story of cosmogenesis. So recollecting the story of the cosmos, but doing that in a way that includes the storyteller to catalyze a kind of initiation of awakening in and as the cosmos. So there's the philosophy, the cosmology, and then of course the consciousness that we, many of us in PCC, draw from the depth psychological tradition, which Freud used anamnesis or recollection as the basic process of depth psychological insight. And of course, Jung took it to a whole new level with archetypes, drawing from the whole Platonic tradition. Anyway, so I was just reminded from your presentation how generative and just remarkable this genius was and continues to be. So just bowing to you.
Thank you
for that. But if you want to comment on any of that, that's great. But it was more of a remark than a question.
I would say completely agree with you, and that's one of the reasons I love Plato, but also this dialogue just struck me when I reread it. I just reread it in May and wrote this since then, but just struck by this exact thing. And I would just add that basically Bergson too is also like in that exact same thing and like in that same tradition and has so much more in common with Hegel than maybe appears on the surface as well. So thanks, Sean.
I see Seraphim next.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. That was amazing. And I can't wait to read more, especially because I'm involved in a couple of efforts with groups that are working on what might be called mutually accelerated disclosure. Two of the most prominent, well, one of the most prominent is being done. It's a dialogos group. I don't know if you've heard of this technique or not. Professor John Vervecchi from the University of Toronto has developed this method for, basically it's a kind of anagogy where we go from a level of simply sensing to a higher level of kind of noesis, but it's a collective noesis where we're all engaging each other so that we're all creating a kind of a resonance or a harmony among each other, where we reach this level of kind of a group mind, a kind of murmuration. And we do something similar in a Kabbalistic circle that I'm involved with, where each member of the circle stands for the energies of one of the sphirot, and we all kind of harmonize together and create this kind of there's an emergence of an entity as part of this effort. And so what we're seeing in both of these groups is kind of the promise for this group attunement for a lot of our political problems, and what John Vervecchi calls the mega crisis or the meta crisis, especially because it seems like each individual in our society, there's much discord in our society, clearly. And yet, if we work on the premise, I think the charitable premise, that each person from their own point of view is right, that would mean that each particular constituent is actually sounding a note, which is a pure and clear note from their own point of view. But when the notes sound together, they sound together in discord. And part of what we're trying to do in our groups of dialogos and the Kabbalistic circles is show the way that when groups get together, we can each sound our own particular note and yet come into accord.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm really kind of asking for, until I get to read more of your wonderful work, is how this work that you're doing might apply to this collective work we're doing in generating this this what Gurdjieff called, harmony of the soul, or conscious harmony?
Yeah. No, this is an incredible question, and it's something I didn't really go into the details of. I mentioned sort of how Socrates brought these things up in the Republic, and how he said, like, this scale is this kind of soul, and this scale is this kind of soul, and like how each kind of soul within the city that he saw had a particular way of being expressed in a different musical scale, right? And there he gives like a much more concrete sort of like political version of this. And I guess the one way, I mean, it's hard to know how you go from everybody's tone is correct to people's tones need to be tuned to play together, right? And I mean, I think that one of the things about harmony that is so rich as a metaphor is the idea of sympathetic resonance. So I could briefly explain what sympathetic resonance is. If anybody knows like how a sitar works, you have the strings that you play, but then there are other strings underneath that you don't touch. But that when you pluck one, that other string will vibrate without being touched, like spooky action from a distance. It will vibrate along with the other notes. And those ways of sympathetically resonating are also why certain chords sound so consonant, because there's more sympathetic resonance between them. I can do one little like demonstration. I don't know if this will be, I have my piano down here. So I have the sympathetic resonance turned on this. It's just a piano, right? But the piano has certain overtones, one being the octave. So in this note, you have this note as well. And so this note will sympathetically play with this one, which I can show by pressing down the key very lightly and then hitting this one. And then, so that technically would be that key's string still vibrating because the damper is pulled off of it. This software that I have is really amazing. It lets you do quite a bit. So I'll do another example of that. Like if I hold down this one, which is the third in that chord. Were you all able to hear that? The resonance of that third note coming off. So basically that's part of the basic structure of all sound and musical harmony, is that certain frequencies vibrate together because they're the same in some way. They're different, definitely different, but they're the same in some way. And that has to do with their vibration, right? So 100% like this idea of the emergent unity through like a harmonic metaphor. It's a metaphor, but it's also literally the same thing. Like a harmony is an emergent unity in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and the parts actually become more than they were outside of the harmony because of sympathetic resonance. They're actually increasing each other's vibration and power and clarity and knowledge and virtues and all of these things, right? And that's kind of this Greek idea that like through friendship, through philosophical community, we all resonate more. Yeah.
Robert.
Yes. Thank you, Jack, for a thrilling lecture. So inspiring and exciting in so many ways. Thank you. I'm really grateful and excited. A little comment when you were talking about Socrates' death being, in a certain sense, a failure. It reminds me of Royce's idea of the lost cause. Jesus' death, the two most famous deaths in the West and maybe in the world, were both failures that led to, of course, extraordinary transformation, which we're discussing right here, and etc. So I love that idea of the lost cause with respect to both Socrates and Jesus. But then my question is, several times you use the term initiation, philosophical initiation. And I was wondering, in the case of Socrates, and then perhaps in different case for Plato, how much of a deed were you thinking of? Were they initiated, as in an initiator in the, like Elizabeth Hike's book on Egyptian initiation? Were they put through a process such that they came out with a higher idea, which makes sense in the case of Plato more than Socrates? He says, well, Socrates would have been transformed to a very, very, very high method, and Plato would have been transformed into some answers, which, interestingly, he undoes in almost every case. I mean, the Sophist and the Theaetetus, and what's left of the Republic, and what's left of the, etc. So, do you have any light to shed on what, if either one was initiated? Was it in a mystery center? Was it with a higher being? Was it anything that we can sort of get hold of?
That's such a great question. Yeah. So, I mean, I want to say that the meaning of initiation is multiple. So on the one hand, we can think about it kind of stripped down as just analogous or metaphorical of insight, right? Like when you've been initiated to a mystery, you have seen into it, right? So that's one element. And even that is enough to make it useful as a metaphor in philosophy. But you also have this idea of kind of like consecration. And this, I think, is the trickiest part for us, right? Because Socrates, and Nietzsche gets at this, like the Socratic piety is like, can we think of ourselves this way? Like Socrates is like, I'm sent by the god Apollo, and what I'm doing is like totally right, and like no one can tell me that it's not, right? So Socrates comes off with this kind of like almost belligerent courage, right? Which I don't think is what we're supposed to have. But I do think that there's something about insight which is so transformative that it's irreversible. There's no turning back, and you see everything. Like the reframing is so radical that your entire orientation is different, right? And like near-death experiences, the confrontation with death, like encounter with death, these all have this profound gestalt shift. And I think Socrates is really pointing at that, like that aspect of philosophy is the central aspect of philosophy. So like, even if we reject all of the doctrines in the Republic, I think that the fact that the Republic is more or less an analogy for the soul and how we become a musical soul, become a philosophical soul, right? It's more about, it's not about the way, it's not, okay, so it's not about the doctrine, the truth, the mystery could be a certain secret that only the initiates tell each other. It's not about that. It's not about the information which is revealed, between the initiates. It's about a transformation that changes our way of being. And here the word way isn't quite as good as the word mode, right? Because a mode is a musical scale, right? An attunement. It's our way of being, like the transformation of initiation retunes the soul, gives it a new mode in which it acts. And like, I think that, Socrates, various Stoics, Plato, Kierkegaard, like Nietzsche, people with very divergent views, completely different orientations in cosmology, perhaps, maybe not completely different, but differences, still have the same kind of temperament, still have the same attunement, still have the same, mode of being. One other thing I would just mention is that, in Greek, the word initiation is teleos, and like teletai is the initiate. And this idea of like completeness, tele means complete in Greek. This comes into Aristotle, and like Aristotle is always, the driest philosopher in the world, but some of his terms are like so rich with meaning, like entelikeia, which means like actuality, if you want to completely like remove all the fun from the word. But the tele there, it means complete, but it also means initiated or enlightened, right? Like initiation is a kind of enlightenment. And when we come to know the principles of things in ourself, in our soul, we find a mode of being that we have never encountered before, never properly like made sense of, which he calls entelikeia, which is like this continuous movement of the soul, continuous and yet perfect and insightful and complete form of reality, which is our soul, right? So in a way, I think that some of that bleeds over into Aristotle, even though it's not obvious on the surface, that Socrates or that philosophy necessarily is a kind of initiation, a kind of transformation that reframes everything. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great answer.
So a little ways back, Monica Duras Bowles asked a question in the chat that I failed to
Great.
communicate. So I'll go ahead and read it out, unless Monica's here and wants to say it herself. But sometimes people put it in the chat when they can't speak. Monica, did you want to say it or do you want me to?
You can say it, Jacob. You can,
Okay.
you can read it.
Sure.
Okay.
So Monica asked, what if there was something about existence as a whole, the whole developing universe, inner and outer, internal subjectivity and external objective manifestation of relations, beyond duality of soul and body, the whole body, that goes beyond the axial experience of inner realities, such that the universe as a whole might be experienced as meaningful. And we are part of it, part and whole. Does that feel possible?
I mean, that sounds like Platonic philosophy to me. One way people kind of reflect that idea is like every Platonic dialogue is a whole, and it's a whole that is a view on the greater whole, which is cosmos and existence, but it's also just one view on that. So each dialogue is kind of integral. It's kind of a whole greater than the sum of its parts, but is also less than the whole that is the entire universe, because it's only one perspective on that whole. I'm not sure if that adequately gets at what you were asking, but
Is it fair for me to say something now?
please, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so when you say that it's Platonic, where is the source? Where is the source of that meaning? One. And then secondly, I'd like to suggest that in this world that I'm describing, maybe there's a way that we could think of the sum of the parts being less than the parts.
Yeah.
Because in a time developing world, we're actually converging, and things hold steady in ways, so that when you have that, what you were describing as the
A sympathetic resonance.
Sympathetic resonance, when you have a sympathetic resonance, it's not held in awareness, it just is in the relationships that are now holding steady. And so it frees up the present moment to be engaged in new becomings, new new developments in the not yetness of the future.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, but
Yeah.
First question is, where is that soul that you're describing?
I mean, so that question basically for Socrates, I'm not entirely sure, but Plato kind of gets at this in the Timaeus with the idea of the world soul. It's such a weird dialogue that's hard to know what we're supposed to accept and what we're supposed to question and all of these kinds of things. I think the Greek view, like even Plato and even the Stoics, still have this idea that like meaning comes from the divine order, and like ultimately human life is at the behest of the divine kind of theater. And I mean, you get some of this kind of like breakaway from that through the sophists and through some of the philosophy and atheism and natural philosophy of the pre-Socratics and things like that. But you really get a reaffirmation of it and a reframing of it. And again, like Robert said, like re-questioning these ideas. I mean, you never see Plato reject utterly the theory of the forms, but you see him question every aspect of it, you know, and not resolve those questions. So, I mean, basically for Plato, it's the forms that make meaning in the world, the good, the beautiful, the true, right? And kind of, I don't want to get too Neoplatonic because then everything just becomes kind of like degradations of those realities. And I think that that view is not entirely in Socrates. There's something, and maybe it's not entirely in the Neoplatonics either, but like not everything is just a sort of degraded form of divine reality, although everything is a sort of degraded form of divine reality. It's also participation in divine reality, basically. Then the second thing, you know, the whole being less than the sum of the parts. I think that that is a super important idea. I don't know where that could be found in Plato. I want to look for that, but it's definitely in Aristotle. I have an article about this, about kind of emergence and holism within Aristotle and how his account, because this phrase, like the whole is more than the sum of its parts, comes from Aristotle. He actually says the whole is other than the parts, it's beyond the parts. And he opens this double interpretation. So yes, on the one hand, the whole, like our flesh is made out of, for Aristotle, is made out of like the elements, right? Fire, water, earth, air. But the mixture is more than the sum of the parts. It's greater than anything that fire, air, or water can do on their own. It can do something in integration that it can't do in disintegration. But at the same time, Aristotle says, the parts have potential that needs to be held in check in order for them to converge, right? So there has to be potentials within the material of the flesh that are also less than they would be if they weren't integrated into the whole. So Aristotle is like very, in my opinion, clear about laying that out. And that's like something that we'll talk about in the metaphysics of integral ecology in my course next semester.
Thank you.
Yep.
Carol.
Thank you, Jake. Jack, that was wonderful. As someone who likes to sing hymns and spiritual songs and mantras throughout the day, I really appreciate you focusing on music, song, resonance, all of that harmony, the chords. And I just wanted to say the one remark that you said that meant the most to me, and I probably won't get your wording precise, but the one remark that fascinates me was when you said, death is regular life with our fears and vices. And if you'd like to speak more on that, I'd appreciate it.
So yeah. That, so I kind of flagged this at the beginning and then brought it back at the end, that basically Socrates's life in a way blurs death and life, right? And it kind of like effaces the dualism between life and death. And you know, in Socrates' death, we see the beauty and the integrity of his life, right? And like the piety and everything. And then in the, you know, taking in a way the Eleusinian mystery to be, or maybe the Orphic mystery to be a revelation to us of our soul through an encounter with death. And we don't entirely know that. Socrates basically kind of says that, and other sources say that. Maybe there was some like ritualistic death, like probably there was, like all the stories that all the myths that they're telling are like that about that. So that's probably what it was. So in that experience of our encounter with death, and I think that, like, you know, near-death experiences really show this. The myth of Ur shows this in the Republic. The near-death experience changes the way people view their life, right? And from that new perspective, it's like, holy shit, like I was living in death, right? I was living, and I think Heraclitus has a really beautiful fragment that gets at this, like, people are sleeping, he says, which is less intense, right? Most people live their life asleep. Well, it's the same idea, except more grim. That we like live in a state of death, which is our trapment to the fear of death. And again, that branches into the fear of ignorance, of being ignorant, and all of these other fears. So yeah, this kind of, and this idea comes up in Plato all the time. It's called chiasm, which is like the Greek letter chi, that, and a chiasm in poetry is like putting a sentence in one direction and then flipping the direction. So it's used in music all the time, like, you know, whatever, right? Following the same path up and then back down, right? That from death to life and then from life to death, this chiasmic movement, you don't return the same as when you left, right? And that's always the Platonic chiasmic structure, that when you flip, like reversing the order of the words somehow changes completely our apprehension of its meaning. And Plato's really like thinks that aspect of poetry has a huge input to just the very transformation of the soul itself, and gives us this kind of like insight into how that movement between death and life, or philosophy and sophistry, or in other dialogues, it's like the true statesman, or like someone who's a real leader versus the tyrant, right? And it's by going from the extremes and then returning that these things completely, like the tyrant in the beginning of the Republic is the happiest person in the world, according to Thrasymachus. Then by the end, he's 729 times more miserable than the philosopher. So these kinds of flips happen all the time, and it is also essential to the deep structure of our consciousness for Plato.
Awesome, thank you. Also, you had a quote from Julie Sanchez Perotti that was lovely, but I did not manage to capture it all. And
I'm sorry about that.
And I didn't. No, you don't need to apologize. I'm also multitasking, crocheting for grandchildren. So the word energy was in it, and I have recently been contemplating subtle energy. This idea came to me during meditation one morning as subquantum, and partly, I mean, it's multiple things. Subtle energy exists in multiple forms, but as subquantum. And then I realized that that idea related to what Paramahansa Yogananda in Autobiography of a Yogi referred to as lifetrons and the Om.
Mm-hmm.
Then I started looking at some more things online, and to me, that Om as the vibratory resonance in all of reality somehow connects with all of this that you were talking about musically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you'd
Definitely.
like to talk about any of that, please do.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing that makes me think of is this idea of sort of less than the whole again, like by the, you know, the subtle energy is less than the matter that it moves, but it's also what allows the convergence of those parts to be more than the sum of the parts. So it's this kind of, again, paradoxical more than and less than. And you know, I think in my my teaching demo that you asked some really incredible questions for, we talked a bit about energy in Aristotle, right? Energeia, he's the one who kind of like coins this word. Um, and I mean, I think that this is already totally at play in Socrates' idea of the soul, that there's this, I mean, that there's multiple types of soul. Almost like you have daimon, which is this kind of inner voice that is almost entirely moral, I guess you would say. You have guardian spirits, which in the end of the Phaedo, he actually goes into these a bunch. You have the kind of animate spirit of the body, which is like called thumos, right? Which Aristotle again kind of like compacts all of these together into his term energeia, to kind of umbrella all of this type of energetic, dynamic, organizing activity, guiding life, guiding the mind, guiding the spirit, guiding our actions morally, all of these kinds of things, right? And yeah, I mean, this more than and less than, one of my recent favorite philosophers, Vladimir Jankelevich, who's a Bergsonian who writes on music and many other things. He wrote a book called Je ne sais quoi, and I'm forgetting the French word, but almost nothing. So an indescribable quality, je ne sais quoi, and almost nothing. I'm forgetting the French word right now. So the whole is an indescribable quality. It's a what, I know not what, you know, like we know, like you hear the harmony. It's clear that what it is, but like now describe it to me. Pff, like so hard to do, right? It's almost nothing, and yet it's everything, right? So it's this subtle unity and quality that is both unnameable. I don't know what it is, but I know it more intimately almost than anything else. And it's almost nothing. So I think that those descriptions of music apply to the energy of the soul, the kind of subtle, unifying and insightful and convergent aspects of spiritual life.
Thank you. Perhaps ne presque rien?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Or just presque rien. Yeah. Almost nothing. Yeah, presque rien. Thanks.
Thanks, Carol. We're almost out of time here, but I think we've got time for one more. Matt, did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Sure, thank you. And thanks, Jack, for such a fun presentation. I really appreciated, especially the slide that you had of all of the sort of etymological variations with Hades and eternity, and I can't even remember all of those. But it reminded me of, I don't know if it was, ragtime songs, or you have this sort of like dominant riff, and then you have all of these sort of variations on these riffs, and it gets, increasingly complex and complex and complex. And so I guess one of my questions was, what is the sort of root at the heart of all of these, if there even is one? And then just there seems to be kind of like a level of play there, just kind of playing with these words. And so I'm just curious your take on these variations, this play, and the emergent meaning that comes out of this sort of coherence of all of these variants. So I just thought I'd give you an excuse to talk about that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so the core of all of these diffusions into different etymologies and all of this stuff, the core of that is recollection, right? So, and recollection, again, like, is already kind of a multiplicity. Like, we can think of remembering and recollection also, as Socrates points out, is a kind of association, right? But more importantly, it's this like preserving and gathering, generally speaking, like that the soul does, right? So like associating, contrasting, all of this movement, this activity, that's the core. And like I think that the core as recollection is also care, right? And care is essential to music because you're practicing and you're giving your attention and all of these things. And to play, and music is a kind of play, right? And I mentioned, I think just really briefly in passing in my talk that, you know, when we see Socrates or Plato at play and making these like imaginative connections, it awakens something in us of the playful spirit that is Plato or Socrates that is making these connections, right? It sort of alivens within us our own sense of our playfulness. It not only like sort of invites us to play in the same way that when you hear music, it invites you to sing along or to tap your foot or, you know, subtly participate. I think this playfulness subtly inspires us to be playful ourselves. And when we are, we notice that souls are playful things, that we are a soul, and that that soul is eternal and survives the play of its embodiment. Does that get at your question? Do you want to follow up or?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I'm just reminded. I think I saw Brian and Sean talking about cosmogenesis recently, and evoking Vogelin with regards to anamnesis and the sort of ordering process that comes from that sort of remembering and remembering the experiences that are so formative, I think. So I'm just thinking of, you know, play as this ordering force that brings all of these together in this sort of constellation around a dominant kind of gravitational force. So anyway, I'm just
totally agree. No, I completely agree. And Aristotle, when he analyzes music, he looks at like the aspect of play in music and sort of says like music is good for so many different things. And one of them is like that it's playful, right? And everything playful is a kind of leisure that is a harmless pleasure that reinforces kind of communal good feelings and things like that. It's not the only good. We also have therapy and like educational purposes and yada, yada, yada. There's a bunch of other, it helps attune our souls to be philosophers and stuff. But I definitely think this element of play is great. And I love it. And I think it's essential to this.
Awesome. Thanks, John.
I've also noticed like there's amazing comments in here that it's going to be hard to get to all of these. Hopefully I can get like a printout maybe of these.
I can send you the chat transcript, Jack.
That would be great. Yeah, maybe I could answer some people's.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jack, for such a rich and harmonious evening. It was an absolute delight. Let me just invite everybody to join me in saying thanks to Jack for sharing with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, great presentation, Jack.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Lovely.
I know it's 10 p.m. on the East Coast, so
yeah.
thanks for staying up for us too.
This was such a great turnout and such a great conversation.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
And thanks to everyone who stayed till the end. I know it's getting late, but this was really rich.
Ditto.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
Lily.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Thanks, Jack. Good job.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Robert. This was fun.
Bye.